Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar with a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In this podcast, we interview scholars, thinkers, and writers from different disciplines, inviting them to discuss what interests them about utopias, dystopias, and speculative fiction.
Whether you're a student, scholar, or someone looking for reading recommendations, we hope you enjoy listening along. If you do, please let us know by rating and following the podcast wherever you are listening, leaving us a comment, or dropping us an email on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So then, Matt, who did you speak to this time around?
Well, Liam, in this episode, I was joined by Taylor Cavallo, who teaches at the University of Minnesota, and Mark Gatto, lecturer in the business school at Northumbria University. Taylor and Mark are working on a piece relating specifically to work-life balance and what we can learn from two dystopian television shows, which is Severance and The Handmaid's Tale. So we started out talking a bit about that paper. Both Taylor and Mark studied English at university, and so they bring that interest in literature and dystopia in particular to what might otherwise seem like an unusual subject area of business or organizational studies. Actually, they had a bunch of different kind of labels for it. So kind of going along those kinds of lines, I think, of kind of, the sort of business speak, what do you actually call yourself, which I've been kind of struggling with at universities recently, where everything is becoming management speak, and everyone's got 20 different job titles. But anyway, I'm digressing already. In our discussion about work-life divide, we touched on questions about fantasy versus reality, the idea that we can separate these two fields, and much of this was explored through discussions about parenthood, which both Taylor and Mark have written extensively about. Mark's written a book, Parents at Work, a dystopian ficto-criticism to subvert patriarchal organizations, and Taylor, in her PhD and several articles which she's published recently, also focuses on issues to do with parents at work. So Mark also talked about the problems that come with so-called flexible work and the tendency of those working flexibly to self-exploit, something that you definitely see a lot of, I think, in academic workspaces. But notably, I think underlying so much of our conversation was issues relating to gender in the workplace. Taylor started her career in human resources. There's another kind of awful business term, which is very dystopian, I think, humans as resources, and was particularly, I think, during her time struck by challenges for parents coming back to work. So she was working in HR before she was herself a parent, but she was really interested in how maybe sort of some of those challenges she hadn't perhaps anticipated for people coming back. And my wife is literally this week starting back at work after a period of maternity leave. So that obviously resonated with me. Mark has been working on ideas of resistance and has used dystopian fiction to provide a model for how modes of resistance can translate to the workplace. So he was inspired by feminist manifestos, and some of our discussion reminded me of the kinds of things we were exploring in our other double guest episode, which was episode 10. I think it was episode 10 anyway, I'm starting to be corrected, when we spoke to Ruth Houghton and Aoife O'Donoghue about the relationship between utopia and the law. So from there, we discussed issues relating to paid and unpaid work, particularly work done by women in the domestic sphere. And again, that had me thinking back to episode 14 when we interviewed Atta at Uni and we explored social reproduction theory. And then, when applying some of these sort of big ideas found in dystopias, Mark was really drawn to the kind of more grassroots, small scaleness of the depictions of resistance found in the novel version of Children of Men, written by P.D. James. And this he sort of felt made resistance seem achievable in some capacity. In the latter half of the discussion, we talked about the role businesses can play in society today, particularly against a backdrop of regressive social change led by dystopian politics. So this was something we returned to very late in the interview with a lengthy discussion about how businesses responded to the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US, and a little about sort of changes to working habits after the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, sort of Taylor and Mark also talks a bit about the value of bringing dystopian fiction into spaces like business as a way to make the subject more relatable for students and more engaging, also for kind of readers alike.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really good summary. And thanks for doing the interview. It was really interesting to hear both Mark and Taylor's insights on this topic throughout the episode. Something I think that stood out for me was in their sort of initial discussion of the piece they're writing together on both The Handmaid's Tale and Severance and work-life balance. I think Mark used the terms integration versus segregation. So integration is where, you know, work equals life, if you like. Yeah, there's a real blurring there of the boundaries, whereas segregation is where they are fully distinct. And integration is, I suppose, represented by The Handmaid's Tale and segregation by Severance. And what I thought was interesting is that in both of those models, they're dystopian, right? Like there's something deeply unsettling or unpleasant about them. You know, for Offred, there's, I suppose, the inescapability of her work and her duties. You know, her work is all consuming. And in Severance, although it's not, I've not watched it, but you and I have talked about it enough for me to have a good enough idea, and you know, I've seen enough commentary online about it. The idea that there is, I suppose, for one of people's halves, I don't really know how to best. It's innies and outies, isn't it? But I don't know which way around it is.
It's belly buttons.
Yeah, that's what I thought it meant the entire time. But for like the work-free people, I'll call them that, and you can just tell me which one that is. That's quite utopian, right? Like it's blissful. There's maybe no toil or less toil, but then their other half is permanently at work, and that is nightmarish, right? Again, I suppose it's likewise inescapable. So I suppose, obviously, these are dystopian texts, dystopian works, and so they're going to go to nightmarish extremes, perhaps. But it clearly is pointing out that we've got an issue with work-life balance and maybe our attitudes towards work now. Also, I just wanted to comment that it was nice that we had, I suppose, like long-time listeners of the podcast come and join us. It was really great to have people who have been engaging with us and clearly have been listening along from really early on. I know Mark was one of the first people to have either emailed us or commented on the podcast, for example. So yeah, really nice to have them come along and sort of I don't know. They I suppose by the end of the episode, we see that they really know the rules of the podcast, because they blew the reading list recommendation out of the water without even waiting for you to offer them multiple texts. So that was nice.
Yeah, I do worry though, Liam, if we have people who are listening to the show on as guests, then who are we going to have listening? As in, the only way we sort of generate new listeners is by inviting them to be guests on the podcast, and then that forces them to listen, right? So I do. We're going to run out of people eventually. No, that was nice. Yeah, I mean, I just have to, send a quick thanks to Taylor as well, as with our other North American guests we've had on the podcast, for accommodating a morning interview, morning on her, for her at least, and also because obviously she's living in a suburb of Minneapolis, and it's obviously pretty chaotic, stressful, complicated there right now, and for making time for our little kind of podcast, I suppose, with all that going on in the background, I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
Actually, this sort of made me think a little bit about sort of the US context a bit. And this isn't really something that perhaps that we can get much out of a discussion here. But one thing I kind of came away wanting to have asked, if you like, looking back at the interview, was, I wonder how much it's actually kind of almost advantageous for US companies to sort of, I suppose, get involved in politics in a way, because of the way in which healthcare, is provided often through health insurance through companies that you work for over there. So, as a Brit, I suppose it feels really alien to think about that. I just can't imagine, for example, a company that I was applying to in Britain offering me, healthcare provisions that were not provided by the state for, as
Yeah,
a kind of means to. I mean, there are companies that do that, but whereas there, I think it's more integrated, if you see what I
yeah.
mean. So I thought that might be a kind of interesting thing that I almost sort of want to ask Taylor what she thinks about. So maybe she can, if she's listening to this again, she can write in and tell me what she thinks about that. Is it easier for US companies I guess, are they more involved and more embroiled in the kind of
Mm.
political space because of that already pre-existing relationship to kind of health insurance?
Yeah, I
Um,
suppose are they more active, i.e., like in an activist sense, right? Can they enforce or enact change? And I think like there's a point in the discussion between the three of you where things are moving more in that direction. Especially speaking in the light of Roe v. Wade. I wonder if you know, are there some organizations that, because they're doing some of the hard work or heavy lifting, does that sort of excuse political actors from doing the same? Does it give the government basically an easy ride because, oh, well, businesses will sort it out? Or is it the flip, and does that, I guess, spur the government on to do some of that change?
Probably the one other thing I think from the interview that I would have really loved to talk about a bit more, which was this idea of work-life balance, which I did sort of chime in a little bit on, but when you've got two guests, you kind of want to make sure they've got sort of space to have their say, and so I felt a little bit sort of I would take a bit more of a step back than I normally do. And I've obviously written a bit about this in connection sort of with utopian fiction in particular rather than dystopian fiction. And as someone who would categorize themselves, I suppose, as utopian, and I'm using air quotes here that you can't see, maybe we'll have to discuss what that actually means at some point on the podcast. But my feeling is that a better world would involve doing much less work than we currently do. And I was having this discussion with students the other day, and I'm trying to, I suppose, be honest with them. I suppose we kind of have to admit, at least to ourselves, that most jobs that we do are essentially unproductive in some capacity, right? Worse than that, most jobs simply generate demand for goods which require great resource use to produce, or which eventually end up in landfill. So if we want to tackle climate destruction or whatever we want to call it, we need to consume less, but we also need to work less. Like, when we put in work hours, we essentially use up resources to some extent. So, if we could easily think about this in relation to the episode, last episode of the podcast on kind of climate destruction, right? But, I find that this idea that we work less tends to meet with a lot of cynicism, particularly even from young people. And I, maybe that's simply a product of students not having already spent years of their life in employment. So maybe they're kind of itching to get out there often, aren't they? So they're more likely to be worried about whether there'll be any jobs for them rather than the actual, act of doing the work. But I do just kind of wonder about why our world places so much emphasis on employment as the measure of individual worth. Like, I think that's pretty deeply dystopian. And while we continue to hold that value central, we're going to struggle, I think, to deal with many of the issues that we face today. So I think, I'd have kind of loved to have had more of a discussion about that aspect as well, and the kind of centrality, I suppose, of work in our lives, and whether that is itself sort of dystopian.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a huge amount to say then, other than it sounds like there's ripe ground for a sort of work two, or a sequel to this episode, or an episode that is a sequel in its spirit. Because you're right, I suppose there's a lot of jobs that we do that are sort of done for the sake of doing them almost, and even your discussion there about resource, and we work to create things, and or like we create things in our work, and we work to then use up those things too, or to buy those things, and so on. Like, that sounds like a pretty vicious cycle. But as you were saying that, it reminded me of Goldstein's book in 1984, just where they're talking about how the sort of delicate balance of the three super states, and that, you know, they are constantly producing material goods for the war efforts, and like it all seems rather pointless because the war efforts aren't going anywhere, but nor are the material goods benefiting the general populace, and so on. And it seems like it's this almost paradoxical, oxymoronical. It's this inefficient efficiency, right? It's this unproductive productivity, which is, you know, deeply double thinking in you know, classic Orwell sense, but maybe speaks to a bit of a dystopian paradox that we are experiencing today too.
Capitalism loves a crisis, Liam. You know,
It does. It does.
Naomi Klein, shock doctrine. Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. You know, ultimately, people make money from crisis and collapse and rebuilding. You know, a hefty part of you know, the cycle of kind of creative destruction is destruction. You know, we tend to focus on the creation side of it, but it tends to involve, you know, destroying things in the first place. You know, there'll be plenty of people that will be making money off of climate destruction, ultimately. Yeah. Yeah, it shows that there is perhaps a little bit more of a connection between last episode and this episode than it might otherwise seem on paper, because they otherwise seem like really opposite kind of discussions that we were having. You know, one was very much about the kind of big problems. You know, in the last episode, it was very much like, you know, the big scale thinking on a kind of global level, and here we've got the kind of the personal, you know, the individual work-life balance. How do we not take work home with us? You know, these kinds of questions. So they seem opposite, but actually they're intimately connected.
Yeah, for sure. Before we pass over to the interview, Matt, I just wanted to acknowledge thanks to Taylor for referencing my work as well at the end of the discussion. You know, by all means, we're talking about work, and maybe this is a bit self-aggrandizing of myself, but it just was a bit complimentary and just reminded me that the work that I did in the past, someone somewhere finds it interesting, and maybe that should motivate me to do a bit more work, which maybe was defeating the point of this episode. I'm not sure.
I won't tell you then, Liam. I was going to say I did actually pay her to make that reference.
Thanks, Matt. Well, on that note, shall we perhaps pass over to the interview?
Absolutely, let's go. I'm delighted to have with me today Mark from Newcastle and Taylor joining us from Minnesota. The wonders of technology, all the way from Minnesota. We're beaming out there. Brilliant. So can you guys introduce yourself to our audience in a better way than I just did, which isn't difficult?
Sure. So my name's Taylor Cavallo. I'm an instructor at the University of Minnesota. My research is focused on work and gender, so I'm interested in work experiences of women, specifically mothers, both paid work and unpaid work and labor within the domestic sphere. And my research really looks at, you know, how work experiences shape identity, create meaning, and how they fit into or challenge larger cultural narratives, which is sort of how I got interested in looking at dystopian fiction. It just kind of comes out of my own love of the genre. I was an English major as an undergrad. I love to read. I read a lot of horror and sci-fi, and dystopia was sort of another related genre that I just kind of stumbled into and have been fascinated by ever since. And by the way, I just want to shout out your Halloween episode where you talk about the boundary between horror and dystopia. It's something I definitely thought about in relation to like Severance, specifically the TV show. Yeah, and I'll shout out just before Mark does his intro that we're actually working on something related to Severance and The Handmaid's Tale together that looks at the extremes of work-life balance discourse within kind of high control environments through those dystopian texts. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Taylor, are you auditioning to replace me in the as co-host of the podcast already? Because you're already getting in links to other episodes. I mean, that's that's better than I tend to do. So
I'm trying to, you know, doing what I can here, trying to do my best as a guest.
Thanks very much. Mark, what about you? Could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm not sure I can reach that gold standard of links to previous episodes, but it's great to be here. I'm a long time listener to the podcast. So my name is Mark Gatto. So I'm an academic working in Newcastle on time at Northumbria University. It's the business school in Northumbria. My research is loosely equality and diversity and inclusion within the workplace, but I specifically look at that through thinking about parents and carers' experiences in the workplace. And I've used theory around masculinities and gender theory, and also ideas of ideology as well. I'm particularly interested in unconventional methods of researching and writing in a way to communicate what I do differently. And because of my love for dystopian fiction, which dates back to when I was a teenager, and then doing it again, similar to Taylor, did an English degree, so we've got that in common. So that love informs my interest in sort of social justice causes within organisation studies more broadly. And I like to consider myself a bit of an activism person as well within academia. So I like to try and make a difference in the real world as well as on the page. Yeah.
So when I was putting together the questions for this, I was trying to make this a little bit more cohesive. So I focused in on a couple of a particular paper that Taylor had written and a book that you've written, Mark. So based the questions around here, but I'm already going to go off piste because just as we were slightly, talking before we started recording, Taylor mentioned this piece that you were working on together. And it has to do sort of work-life balance, which is something I'm really kind of interested in. I've been writing a bit about myself in relation to sort of play. So, might you tell us a little bit more about that? I mean, so you're using dystopian fiction by the sounds of it, Severance, which I really liked. Well, it's still going on, isn't it? So I don't know when we're going to get the next series. Set to wait quite a while between the first couple. And then the Handmaid's Tale. So something which we haven't talked about a lot actually on the module. I'm in teaching mode, aren't I? On the module so far. No, on the podcast so far. So yeah, I think the Handmaid's Tale was mentioned right in the first episode. Raffaella Bacalini talked about it as a kind of real inspiration for her kind of career in dystopian criticism. But I don't think it's actually really come up since then. So, what about those two texts are kind of interesting in relation to work-life balance then for you guys?
Well, I'll let Mark chime in as well after this, but I think both of them really explore not only kind of the physical embodiment of challenges around work-life balance, but also sort of cognitive, mental, like in your mind, challenges around navigating work-life balance issues. I'll speak specifically to Severance, where that is really kind of the core of the show. Spoilers ahead, I guess, around Severance for those who haven't seen it. But essentially, to be able to work in a specific area within this Lumen organization, this company, people voluntarily undergo surgery to basically split their consciousness in two. And the way that in the show we learn this procedure is marketed and framed as appealing is really around, work-life balance issues. It's bringing up these questions of work-life balance. So the way in which it's framed as something that people might want to do is you can leave your work self at work and you have your, your private life, your home self, so to speak, your personal life at home. Now, these two parts of yourself never know each other. They never meet. And on the one hand, that's really an extreme of what organizations and kind of public discourse talks about with work-life balance, where there should be this divide. And the show explores kind of the, through this exaggerated, media storyline, what the implications of that might be, essentially. So it's your physical body showing up to work, but you have no idea or knowledge of who you are there, what you do. And essentially it's two different selves that are created, which, as you can imagine, has a whole host of problems that the show explores. So to me, I think Severance brings in that really interesting language around that extreme sense of this idea that there could be or should be two parts of self in this work-life balance conversation. And that's up for debate. I think that's up for debate in the show. And I think it's up for debate in real life as well. Can you really split yourself into two? No, the spillover and the carryover makes it muddy.
I don't know, Taylor. I mean, we're going to be talking about parenthood later, and I think parenthood is all about your physical body turning up to work, but your mental
Yeah.
self not being there because you've dragged yourself in, but your brain is just so tired, and you're not really there and present. I mean, I thought Severance was really interesting because I'm kind of interested in the utopian angle of it. I think, as you say, it is obviously it's quite a deeply dystopian take on this, but it's fundamentally a really utopian idea. And in my work, I've been kind of thinking, well, so if you look at the kind of history of labor, and you think, well, particularly during, say, the Industrial Revolution, people were working 60 hours a week or whatever. There was a big push, of course, to work less and to recapture that time. And then I think by about sort of 1920, people were working sort of more on average like 40 hours a week, and then it basically just comes to a halt. Yeah, and we just stay working at about 40 hours a week. And actually, you're kind of when you're talking about workplaces are sort of trying to do this already, but they actually sort of we're finding that they're encroaching on our personal lives, right? And we're looking at work emails in the evening. They come up on our phone. We can't avoid it, right? So it's the intrusion of work into our. It's going in the opposite direction. Is my point. So that to what Severance imagines.
And I think that's what makes the show and the concept of the severance procedure itself, but the themes that the show explores more broadly so compelling is that we are seeing, if you think about like the quiet quitting trend that, Gen Z was really advocating for on social media, where they were like, listen, do your job, show up from 9 to 5, do what your job description requires. And then at 5 o'clock, like shut off, don't do the extras, don't check your email at night. These boundaries that people are seeing are becoming more necessary in order to compartmentalize work in a way and to keep work at work. I think is kind of what the show explores and what makes it so interesting, because again, it's an exaggerated kind of, dystopian example of that the show presents. But these questions and these needs are very real in kind of navigating work-life balance as, employees within, many kind of corporate settings have experienced, especially in the wake of COVID, I think, where the boundaries between work and home became so blurry. So yeah, I think it's a very compelling question and issue that the show talks about.
Yeah, can I come to you then, Mark?
Yeah, so just to kind of build on some of these points, we're interested in the two different ways of thinking about work-life balance, with integration being one perspective and segregation being another. There's a scholar called Hee-Jung Chung who's written quite a bit about flexible work and the paradox of that, in that when you have more flexible work, you often tend to self-exploit. But some of the things that are interesting with this severance idea is the concept of sort of separating those two worlds. It kind of mirrors the idea of a gendered organization. And typically, historically, it's been men who have been able to kind of separate themselves from the domestic sphere. And actually, what we see in Severance is unpacking that a little bit more, because sometimes in discussions of this self-exploitation in flexible work, the argument is what we should have is the absolute separation. And then the other side of the argument, and this is a classic academic discussion, is it's complicated, it depends. For a lot of the time, when you get that sort of separation, it's a fiction that is created. People aren't really separating themselves. As you say, like your body turns up, but your mind doesn't. I've done plenty of drop-offs of my children, and it's like a horrible experience, and they're crying and clinging to your leg. And it takes a while to let that go before you actually can switch into work mode. And that's exactly the fiction that you're kind of perpetuating when you head into the workplace. Oh, I'm now a worker, I'm not a parent anymore. And so this integration and segregation side of it, we kind of wanted to problemize that a bit in what we've been writing about. And obviously I talked a bit in the paper about the Handmaid's Tale, and we kind of looked at that as well as an extreme integration, because there is no, it's a TV show particularly we're talking about for both of these. And in the series of The Handmaid's Tale, we see quite how integrated Offred has to be in the Waterford Hand household, and that kind of talk about surveillance and what that means for someone's sense of self and their identity. But that is often in a kind of idealized utopian version of work-life integration, is the idea of bringing more of yourself to work. So again, we wanted to kind of problematize, well, what could that mean? And is that again a form of exploitation? So both the fictions really give a speculative idea that, people perhaps mask in the real world, but we can get to really explore them in these fictions. So that's why we kind of drawn so much to them. And because of their great popularity and quality, they kind of really do transmit a message that I think a lot of the time academic scholarship sometimes misses the mark. So that's why we like to elevate them a bit more as well in what we're writing about.
Well, it sounds like a great piece. Is there a publication date for this piece? Where can we get access to this?
We're still in the
too early stages?
We're still in the revision phase, but it's looking promising. It is looking promising. So
we don't want to jinx you. So
no.
I'll get back. I'll get back. Steer us back to the questions at this point. I think it's quite a good segue into what I wanted to talk about, because you've obviously been writing between you on these intersections between work, parenthood, and dystopia. Why you would connect parenthood with dystopia, I don't know. As a new parent myself, no connection possible there. But Taylor, for example, I believe that your PhD involved work on gender, motherhood, and work itself. Mm-hmm. And then Mark, you're the author of a book called Parents at Work: A Dystopian Ficto-Criticism. A dystopian ficto-criticism to subvert patriarchal organizations. Got to get the full subtitle in there. Can I start by asking what sort of drew you to these intersections, I suppose? Then Taylor, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Sure. I, prior to starting grad school, started out my professional career working in HR, doing talent management, hiring, employee engagement initiatives, things like that within the advertising industry. And I got to see kind of so many different ins and outs of people's experiences of work and their relationship to work in that role, which was to me the most interesting thing about it. I was also in charge of kind of helping people navigate the transition into maternity leave and back to the office after they had a baby. So in that process of, the return to work specifically, I was really kind of struck by the challenges that people faced when they came back and the decisions around how they would come back and when, and kind of even decisions around not coming back at all for at least a period of time leaving the workforce. This really stood out to me just as someone who's been interested in gender issues, really, as a even academic, prior to starting work as an undergrad, I've been interested in gender and power. So this just stood out to me. And I was not a mom then. I was 24, just out of college. When I became a mom, and I kind of went through the same transitions and saw these challenges more broadly, I really became interested in these barriers that women face and these rigid structures that they were forced to navigate through a variety of different institutions, organizations, policies. And yeah, that's kind of the answer, I guess. A professional reason and a personal reason that kind of got me interested in it. And like I said, dystopia, just as a lover of literature ever since I was younger, I just have kind of stumbled into making those connections myself as well. So yeah.
Thanks. And Mark, what about you?
For me, I've kind of said that dystopian fiction is a love of mine, and it had been for quite a long time. I was kind of in early conversations with Professor Jamie Callaghan, about doing a PhD and just exploring the gender in work and gender and power and gender and leadership in work. And I have a lot of gratitude for Jamie, because she actually encouraged me to be a bit more ambitious and a bit more innovative. And I remember the day when I kind of said, oh, well, I really love dystopian fiction. I'd love it if I could use that in some way. And that's when she kind of lit up, and then we kind of went from there. And I've not really looked back since then. It gave me the permission to do something quite innovative in comparison to what is often done in organisation studies, which is sort of broadly the field that both I and Taylor look at. But yeah, I've always been motivated by injustice, and often I think dystopian fictions at their core shine a light on societal injustice, and they really bring that to the fore in a much more powerful way sometimes than more kind of literary fictions. I mean, literary fictions as well can do that brilliantly, but I think sometimes it really takes it to the edge with dystopian fiction and really highlights contemporary issues. And so one of the things that I've always been drawn to in dystopian fictions is subversion, or resistance, and how that is articulated in the novels that I've particularly enjoyed. And I like to kind of think about the what ifs of that, and how might I respond to that. I think it's really valuable to kind of play some of those scenarios out, but also quite instructive on just the nuts and bolts of how people do organise in oppressive systems, and how might that be possible. You know, things like how do you communicate, how do you bring people together without being observed, and some of those things are really, they've informed some of my later work in more in real life contexts. So how do I think about that? But yeah, as well with dystopian fiction, what I found is a really nice intersection with gender in the workplace. There's a number of dystopian fictions that really explore that quite strongly, and Margaret Atwood's work is obviously very prominent on that theme, but there are plenty of others as well that do so. And that to me became quite exciting the more I was looking into it, and I could kind of see where these two worlds could connect and then take it further. So there, that kind of is where I come from with dystopian fiction, potted history.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of this idea of sort of bringing resistance from resistance to a kind of regime, but actually, you know, bringing it back to sort of on a smaller scale, I suppose, a more local scale, you know, personal scale, to resistance to work. You know,
Yeah.
when someone says to you, "Can you do this?" and you go, no, I can't actually, you know, and people's tendency not to do that, and people's tendency just to brutalize themselves instead, or whatever. This sort of also sort of rings true in the paper I read that you sent across to me, which is about parenthood. Parenthood demands resisting a dystopia in the workplace. And you, in that paper, you identified a manifesto of sorts of 5 demands, which you were drawing from a dystopian novel, Children of Men, which is a really great novel. I don't think it's actually been mentioned on the podcast so far, but it's well worth reading. The film version is wonderful as well, although quite different. Yeah, these demands are intended to reshape how businesses think of parenthood, and subsequently, presumably, encourage the writing of better policies, I would imagine. Might you start by just outlining what those demands are that you sort of request, and secondly, I suppose, why Children of Men? You know, what drew you to that novel?
Yeah, thanks. I would say that the initial genesis of this, again, I have a gratitude to my supervisor for again encouraging me to think this way. But yeah, I think the novel itself offers such a clear way of expressing through language these demands. I was really inspired as well by feminist manifestos. I write a bit about that in the paper, and that kind of history of being a bit utopian again with a bold demand, recognizing injustice. So I wanted to kind of be inspired by what the novel put forward and some of the kind of concepts, and translating that a little bit into parenthood. So the demands are quite closely aligned with parenthood, and the first one is based around policy, and it's to kind of negotiate and make more transparent organizational parental policies. And it's kind of inspired by some of the poor policies that are out there for parents at work, more broadly. We have seen some movement with that since I wrote it even, but nowhere near enough in my view. So things like flexible work, and we can see in the UK the policy space for legislation that's starting to move a little bit in the right direction with day one rights. But it's about, for me, thinking about collective voices, about involving people in negotiations a bit more. I've always had a interest in trade union activism as well. So that's certainly something that I value, and also the voice of networks, the representation of people in work in different ways. So trying to make that more collaborative. The second demand is much more about motherhood, and it's about civil rights for motherhood. And partly this draws a bit on the long-standing separation of paid and unpaid work. So again, what Taylor was mentioning earlier, and where women predominantly are more responsible for emotional labor and in the domestic sphere, and how that's kind of causing of a marginalization over time, especially at the point of motherhood. So in relation with that, the third point speaks to fatherhood. And at the time in particular, I was particularly conscious of, I mean, when I wrote this, I became a father around the same time. I was writing it and becoming a first-time father. So it did inform some of my writing as well. But being conscious of how being a father at work is so much less prominent than becoming a mother. There's the physical side of it where you are physically becoming, which isn't prominent for men. And then there's the discourse of the ideal worker, of the man who doesn't have that responsibility or doesn't take primary responsibility. So I was really interested in unpacking that. So abolishing the silencing of fathers in parental workplace is kind of the bold statement of that. So trying to bring them into the fore. And in recent times, again, in the UK, we've seen some of that starting to happen. So there's a campaign called Parenting Out Loud. There's also a campaign group called the Dad Shift. So these are more prominent national campaigns that are starting to have a bit more of a voice. But at the time when I wrote it, those didn't really exist. So it's good to see that they are starting to. The fourth point was about deporting mothers. So again, this is using the language of the Children of Men, but deporting mothers out of their career paths. And that specifically speaks to the motherhood penalty. And for those on the call who are not as familiar with this concept, it's the kind of, at the point of becoming a mother, women in data, so in the Office for National Statistics, very recent report in the UK showed quite how significant this difference of pay is. So in the years after birth, it was 42% reduction in wage for women over the first 5 years of a child's life. So it's a huge difference. And so not only is it the wage penalty, but it's also typically women who are reducing their working hours, or in the extreme cases, not being employed at all or being pushed out of workplaces. So that kind of deportation language is real, although grounded in dystopian fiction. So again, that's kind of highlighting how important that is. And the final point was a bit more of like a cultural piece around, again, gender roles, but this anticipatory discrimination that women experience in the workplace. So reaching childbearing age within a workplace where there is already anticipation that, oh, you're probably going to have a child soon, so we're going to adapt our behaviours towards you. Maybe we won't give you that promotion because we anticipate that might happen. And other forms of discrimination related to gender norms and gender expectations. So yeah, those 5 demands were absolutely as mapped as possible to the original 5 demands, which I'll very briefly say were kind of more related to the fiction of Children of Men, which were to do with policies around the general election, the sojourners, which were like the immigrant workers, giving them civil rights, abolishing the quietus, which was about the termination of the elderly early to kind of take the burden off society, and it was stop deporting offenders to this penal colony. And the last one was stopping compulsory testing of semen for men as well. And there's the same sort of language I tried to use. But what I really loved about this Children of Men, the novel, so I love the film as well. And in fact, I think it was the film that I was first introduced to, and then read the novel later. The film has a lot of strength. I really love that. But I think that I much prefer the novel because of its subtlety. And I think I much prefer the nuances of the narrative. And I like some of the small scaleness of it. So the group, the 5 fishes who come up with the 5 demands, they're just, I kind of enjoyed how innocent to some extent they were. You could almost see yourself in that role, whereas in the film, They were militarized and they seemed more substantially organized. Whereas the five fishes, they would meet in a church and they came up with this pamphlet that they shared around the local community of their five demands. And they tried to use whatever influence they could. That's how they met Theo and started the conversations. So I really liked that because it felt achievable. It felt like something that you could translate. So it has this grassroots origin, which I've also tried to use in my own organising with parents and carers networks. Is grassroots from the ground up and iterative steps. And I think that's where that novel gives you the space to think about that, whereas the film, which is great, is rapid paced and high action. Also great ideas and aesthetics, but a very different experience for dystopian fiction.
Right, yeah. And by starting with dystopian fiction there, you're also drawing presumably attention to the fact that working practices are dystopian.
yes.
I mean, you're kind of like implying that, right? And
Absolutely.
in the paper you say in dystopian fiction, subversive characters offer a sense of hope and formulate blueprints for resistance that organizational actors can learn from, which I thought was a really, a neat way of sort of summarizing some of what you were just saying there. But it's interesting, I think, for me at least, to hear you using what is quite radical language, or kind of the language of resistance, if you like, that might normally be reserved for the field of, say, politics, to talk about, business in a way. And do you think that's maybe where we can really make change today? I mean, it's your subject area, so you obviously you believe you can do good in it, right? So and maybe Taylor, you can also talk a little bit about your take on this as well. But Mark, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I think it's a yes and no. I think it's definitely, I do believe that there is a real space for that. I think the dystopian mindset in particular, thinking about things as dystopian, is important to not allow this drift that we've seen in recent times, and just accepting more and more change that's regressive. But I do think I'm a huge supporter of political action groups, and I think that's a really important dimension of how things change. But I do think businesses can play a role, and I think there can be a site for change. And you have seen that for parents actually in the UK. It tends to have been more affluent organisations that have taken the step to offer equal parental leave, and that provides a test case for, well, this actually works, and men do this, and men take the time to care for their children when they are given the opportunity to do so. And so when businesses start to do that, that then opens up a discourse where we're not just separating along essential gender lines of who does what. So I think for me, that's where you can start to shift perceptions through the world of business. And as well, I think when you talk about politically engaged acting and social movements, there is a whole tranche of society that don't engage with that. And that's where I often feel I can add value in the business school, is to try and influence ways of thinking. I don't necessarily go into the classroom and put dystopian fiction on the wall and then start to talk in like extreme terms, but I do use some of the concepts of alternative ways of thinking about business. So I talk about care in organizations, I talk about community in organizations, and these are all drawn from, how do resistance groups, what do they prioritize in dystopian fictions, what do they put forward? So it is kind of more subtle, I suppose. But yeah, I do think that the world of business has that. And I'd be interested to kind of see what Taylor wants to add on to this, actually, because it's we both you've had that HR background as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I second, Mark, I second everything you just said, the yes and no piece of it specifically. I don't know if business organizations or like the experience of work more broadly, I guess, can solve all problems, nor do I necessarily think it should. But, work and where we work, how we work is a really significant part of our lives. It's an important space to really kind of actively and critically reflect on. I think it's deeply meaningful. So, on the one hand, want to compartmentalize work, and in many ways should compartmentalize work as just a piece of who we are, but in many ways it's not really just something that we do, it's something that we are, and that it constructs a part of our identity, and we are very, many people are actively engaged in their work, even just from a time perspective. I don't think that means it should fully define us, but in that it's an important place. It starts to take on new meaning. And I think when that happens, it opens the door for transformation and change to be possible within a space that we're actively engaged in. And that goes into a lot of our, self-construction of identity and, things like that. But placing too much emphasis on organizations themselves, I think, and work is an important and related question. So like, what does it mean to continue to centralize work in our workplace and these other significant aspects of private life? So that's something I think that's important for people to reflect on and think about within this broader topic. And through the vantage point of all of us kind of having an interest in dystopia, you could say that, for example, in Severance and The Handmaid's Tale, these are extreme cases of when work becomes so intertwined with who you are and how you live your life and how you move through the world. You open yourself up to this type of control and this type of management and this type of surveillance. So, just an interesting thing to ponder within the same question of like, what is that balance? But I do think it's an important space. I do think transformation and change are possible through organizations. And if they, choose to support employees, they can do that. So yeah, that's how I would answer that, I guess, to add on to what Mark said.
Yeah, I think when Liam and I were sort of thinking about the sort of season of the podcast we're currently doing, we wanted interdisciplinary studies at its heart, or thinking about the sort of links. Business was quite low down on our sort of radar, but actually I think that's what makes it interesting, right? It is that sort of maybe slightly unusual link that we're making. And although you're talking about dystopias, when you're doing so, you're already thinking about utopias, right? You're thinking about, how can we, it's the critical dystopia. How can we kind of draw on dystopian fiction to think about what we should be doing rather than what we're doing at the moment, right? So I just wondered, if in general, you found like you are academics in an unusual field, swimming against the current, if you like. Have you found other academics quite receptive to the kind of language and sort of text you're using or ideas you're using? Or do you find sometimes like, in business, people think that's kind of naivety in some way? I don't know. Mark, what do you think?
It's another yes and no answer for me. So there is definitely, in the field, there's conventional dominant research, which is thinking just about how to make work more efficient, how to engage staff better, work-life balance, all of that. And there is also value in that. And there are people who do that with the right intention as well, to make work better for the people doing the work rather than to make more profit for organizations. But there are definitely also some really prominent scholars who have led the way. I was trying to remind myself of some of these today. So, big names. There's Barbara Czarniawska, who used detective fiction and narrative. She was one of the first people to introduce this idea of using fictions and narratives in management research. And alongside her, that's Carl Rhodes, and who's written quite a lot about use of fiction. In fact, The Simpsons is used in use of fiction and organization. Martin Parker as well has thought about Utopia, an organization. In fact, has an edited book about that. David Knights as well. So there are some really big names, but in more recent times as well. And I know that you've spoken about Ursula Le Guin on the podcast, but so Janet Sayers and Lydia Martin have written about gender in organizations using Ursula Le Guin's work. And that's really, again, they've pushed it even further than some of the kind of ideas of dystopian fiction, kind of going into the realms of science fiction and other worlds and other societies, post-human thinking, which I think gives hope, because there are people out there who are thinking in this way within this sort of field of organization and business studies. So yeah, it's definitely, you do sense when you're trying to put that work out there, there is a bit of this is a strange piece of work to be putting into this journal, but equally there are people you can cite, and there are homes for this work that you can find. And as Taylor and I have found, there are ways to articulate this. And I think as well, it's just more interesting to read and more fun to read about these kind of analogies between dystopian fiction and some of these phenomena. Definitely, gender at work is a really nicely well suited to utopian dystopia, with the history of feminism and dystopian experiences that we still see today. So no, it's a bit of both, but definitely there are people out there. Definitely.
And I think you're setting me up quite nicely there for a segue into gender, and thinking about some of Taylor's work. So Taylor, what about you in relation to that kind of? Do you feel like you're swimming against the current a little bit, or have you kind of found people willing to talk about this kind of thing a bit more?
Well, I think one thing that I want to mention too is that the times I've used other texts has actually been as a teaching tool. So in class, I will say students, from my experience, love it. They love engaging with media that they've seen, especially a little bit of the either like horror or dystopian sci-fi stuff that I'll bring in. It's a really great springboard for conversation. It's a common touch point, especially in the classes that I teach it from, like a critical organization studies angle, but teaching undergrads and talking to them about business and corporate life, if some of them have not ever worked in an office, like sometimes that can be a barrier to these things that they're learning. So I found as a teaching tool, it's great and students love it. As just one thing I wanted to mention before I got into the kind of academic side of things. I will say, like a few years ago, I presented about Severance at a conference, and it was really just kind of high level, like, what is this show communicating to us about modern work life? And essentially, like, why should we care and why is that interesting? I definitely had people who were like, what? Like, like, tell me more about this. Like, I'm intrigued. Like, but I will say, kind of echoing what Mark just mentioned, I've just found that if you kind of can situate your work not only with other scholars who have done similar things, but even just like, I use the example of, I love horror as well as dystopia, as I've mentioned already. But like, I use the example in conversation with people who had questions for me afterwards, just about like, this very common example of Frankenstein. So I'm like, on the one hand, you can read Frankenstein as a monster story, or as is very commonly, explored, you can read it as expressing anxieties about the scientific revolution, or as more recently explored, you can look at it as, looking at being analogous to women's experience of pregnancy and childbirth. So, this one text has a lot of rich meaning. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with Severance here for everybody. It's like, yes, this is a dystopian, like weirdo sci-fi TV show on Apple TV that you may or may not have seen at this point. This was like right after season 1 came out, but it's communicating these really interesting things that are really touching on modern anxieties around work life in a variety of ways that our field should care about. And I am certainly not the first nor the last to be looking at a piece of art like this in a way that, we can extract something from. And I think, again, having that support of like, not only like, here are my citations, but also this practice is not new, is helpful in kind of getting people interested and on board with it. So yeah.
Brilliant. And if you don't mind me coming to you more directly here, I had a look at your piece as well in advance of this, and there was I'm choosing a piece here that goes back a little bit. I'm conscious you've published things since, but it was one that tied in. It was called Beyond the Womb, a mosaic of organizational advocacy for reproductive justice. And I kind of, there's quite a lot of kind of cohesion, I think, with what Mark's doing in terms of the sort of thinking about, drawing on dystopian fiction in a way to think about sort of demands, if you like, and ways in which particularly you can, I suppose, businesses can have a role in this. And I think that was what sort of struck me about this. So obviously you were writing particularly in a contemporary US context, and you outlined problems that have come with recent stripping backs of rights in the US, particularly rights for women. But you make the point that workplaces actually have power to prevent the worst of the damage by properly supporting women, the women that are affected by this in particular. So do you think, are we in a place now where employers can actually start to step up and protect workers at a time when government support seems to be receding rather than advancing? Because I think in a way it's been for much of the 20th century, it's sort of the reverse, where sort of, governments tried to sort of loosen and make things better for workers, and companies would kind of push back against this. I think we're almost sort of seeing maybe a reverse, and if so, what are the incentives, do you think, for businesses to do that? And is that what we're seeing happening, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think first of all, I will say that we're just kind of currently living in a time in the US, at least, where there's just a continued and an increasing lack of trust in government and institutions that are, at least, on paper, meant to kind of protect us and, take care of us. So I do think, yes, again, this yes and no academic answer. I do think that, yes, there are things that companies can do to support employees, and even like broader communities around certain social justice initiatives. The question now that I think is more pressing is like, do they want to and will they? Because it is inherently a risk. Coming out and speaking out in support of something or pledging something is kind of taking a stand, so to speak. And what are the risks inherent to that, and what are the benefits inherent to that? I mean, it's something for organizations to think through. As I've said already, I don't really think that organizations can solve or should be the solve for all problems, but broadly, kind of giving the political climate right now, we are seeing that employees and even consumers, so how they're choosing to spend money and also how people are kind of expecting to be supported by the organizations that they work for, are really demanding more of their companies and their organizations, both, like I said, in the types of benefits that they're offering employees, and also kind of like the way in which companies are publicly engaging with socio-political issues. In the paper that you're referencing, my co-author and I, my co-author's name is Dr. Nicole Dillard, we really talk about this and wrote this in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned, where not all by any means, but many companies came out and said, listen, if you are seeking this type of medical care that is now significantly limited, we will pay for you with travel funding. We will, think through expanding and how to expand medical benefits for you, and really offering this type of financial support very publicly, very quickly after this was announced. So I always think that public statements of support and acknowledgement have to be aligned with actually practices and action that they're taking. But we're also seeing some companies getting backlash for not taking enough action. So I think we're at a moment where the expectations that are being placed on organizations is really kind of showing that the public sees these entities as actors that can enact change, and they're wanting them to and expecting them to, which is interesting.
We've obviously been talking quite a lot about reproductive health, and it's obviously a key issue in this. But you in the paper, you do identify a bunch of other cases where companies had stood up against sort of regressive federal or state policies. I wondered if you might just outline a couple of other instances you uncovered during the research, Taylor, that you found interesting.
Yeah, so we looked at kind of using the overturning of Roe v. Wade as a springboard for, exploring how organizations have been involved in sociopolitical, significant moments and how that's kind of affected organizational life. We used a few, a little examples in our paper that were around marriage equality, number one, and then COVID. So we found that, prior to marriage equality in the United States, many organizations had offered same-sex couples some type of benefits, and also started to embrace more expansive definitions of family in relation to certain benefits. Again, not all organizations, but some did. And then during COVID, when there was just so much change going on in terms of the way that people work, their home lives, their personal lives, and the way that people were kind of forced to navigate so much change, organizations had to be flexible in many ways. People were requiring it and demanding it. just given the broad kind of unsustainability of home life and work life at that time. And we did see that, there were many kind of flexible policies enacted. Obviously, many people transitioned to virtual work, but there were organizations that were attempting to also provide, some sort of mental health services at that time and other types of care supports that really spoke to understanding a need that employees were looking for and requiring during this difficult time. Again, not all organizations, but we did see that, again, through these kind of different turning points, organizations are presencing themselves in some way in parts of employee life that, again, are speaking to a broader socio-political time or, issue that's going on, and thinking through how to either support or enact some type of change for them. So this idea of, all these companies speaking out about pledging financial support for travel and, different types of funding in the wake of Roe v. Wade was surprising to many. But as our paper explores, it's not the first time companies have kind of been places of support during these socio-political moments.
And maybe are they, almost as an implication there that sometimes maybe they're also the leaders in that, and that maybe government policy can change in response to the fact that there's been this kind of shift, or like a kind of herd mentality, perhaps, in workers' rights, etc., and protections for workers. Is that also something you'd say?
I think so, and I think it gets at this idea that Mark raised and something he mentioned earlier around access and privilege. What happens then when organizations, and especially he mentioned more affluent ones, become the ones to spearhead these types of things, then it also becomes about who works at these places and who has access to these things and who does not. But yeah, I do think that there is a very central role that organizations can play when they choose to involve themselves in taking a stand on these types of issues, think through how to provide supports, think through policy and, changes and benefits offerings and all those things. They can, in some ways, do things that, other institutions can't. So, yeah.
It's a bit more sort of upbeat utopianism there to kind of...
Yeah, maybe I'm not as cynical as I thought.
Yeah, I've actually been arguing all week pretty much with the students that they should be less cynical. I'm cynical sometimes, but I think generally speaking, I'm kind of an optimist. I think you kind of have to be
balance
to
it,
get
especially
through
if you're a real cynic like me. When you see little opportunities to balance it out with optimism, you have to take advantage of them and really
check yourself. Yeah, just sort of check yourself and say, no, wait, that's too negative. Got to be trying to think about something more uplifting. So sort of coming to the end of the interview now. So I wondered whether or not, you've already talked a little bit about the fact you're working on a paper together. Did you have any other sort of projects that you have ongoing that you wanted to talk about? Mark, are you working on anything else as well? Or?
Yeah, I suppose as aligned as it can be with the podcast, I'm working on a book about dads at work. So it kind of builds on my previous book. And I'm kind of positioning this as an Ustopia. So in between the genre of dystopia and utopia. So that's something that coined by Margaret Atwood. And I'm particularly interested in dads, thinking about the utopian idea of dads becoming more caring and ideas of caring masculinity, but it's dads who are taking roles in their communities, supporting other dads, being community dads. And I'm interested in what that might become, and into the future, what could that become? So I'm looking at the pockets of that exist now to see what it might be. But equally, I'm also interested in the manosphere and what that might become, and the young men that exist now are interacting with that. What could that become as well? So there are kind of competing strands of masculinity that I'm very interested in. So I'm writing about that and speaking to the dads that are doing this work about that as well. But I've really loved working with Taylor over the time we've worked together on the paper and hopefully we will continue to work together. And to one of your earlier points about finding people who do this work, it was fantastic when we first found each other as scholars in this field. It kind of gives you strength to kind of keep doing it, to find someone who's similarly interested in it. Yeah.
Yes.
That sounds like a book I definitely want to pick up. That sounds really great, Mark. What about you, Taylor?
Well, Mark, I was going to give you a little shout out at the end too. I was going to say, like, working with Mark has been awesome because obviously we're in the same like broader kind of critical organization studies field, but having this like niche little nerdy interest too is a really interesting and creative way to kind of think through, you know, the different types of writing and like research that we can do. So I've really enjoyed working with Mark on our paper, and I can't wait to do more. There's more to do, even just with those two texts, I feel like. But yeah, I do a lot of work on kind of moms in the workplace and different conceptual writing about that. And I'm also, separate from kind of working motherhood, also interested in, as I mentioned earlier, this relationship between paid and unpaid labor. That's gotten me really interested in like the trad wife phenomenon that's going on social media and in real life, I guess, and trickling over into real life for some. So yeah, that is a new kind of emerging interest of mine that I'm excited about. And yeah, just like continuing to think about like expansive definitions of work and what that means for mothers in between, this in between space of domestic life and work life. So yeah, and excited for my paper with Mark to come out when that happens.
This is probably already on your radar, but in a couple of weeks' time I'm teaching Don't Worry Darling on one of my modules. It's absolutely perfect for another dystopian text reader to get your teeth into on that, but I'm sure it's on your radar already. But as a sign off, we always ask our guests to tell our audience of a text, could be a novel, movie, piece of criticism, your own work excluded, of course, that you think everyone should read. So I think particularly in this case, perhaps something for someone looking to think more about the connection between business and working practices or something along those lines, perhaps. Taylor, can you go first?
Sure. So I have probably mentioned it too many times already, but for those who haven't watched Severance, please watch that. Only because my first thing that I was going to recommend, and I know this might be of interest to Liam, who is the endotext guy, I've heard, but through my listening on this podcast. For those who really like Severance,
it's not general knowledge that everyone knows in Minneapolis.
I'm whoever I can tell, I'm dropping his name and the endotext term. People are going to be hearing about it from me.
Excellent.
So one thing I will say, speaking of The Handmaid's Tale, to me, the endotext final chapter of the Handmaid's Tale novel is, I know people can't see me, but I'm going to chef's kiss. Like that really, to me, wraps up an amazing piece of literature, even just, 12 out of 10. Perfect. That really is, to me, everything, about that book. So in the spirit of endotext, I was thinking through, my obsession and my love of Severance. Apple Books has a free downloadable ebook called The Lexington Letter that the creators of the TV show Severance made. And it's really a companion read, or like a companion book that provides a really rich kind of like supplementary storyline, both with helpful exposition for those who may be like confused about the concept of the show, but also for super fans who love the show. It has a lot of really great little Easter eggs, and it really kind of provides another, with new characters, but some crossover, a new outlet for understanding a little bit more just how dystopian and sinister this organization is. But visually, it's also very striking because they use excerpts of like a fake handbook. They have, fake, created lumen imagery that they have, and also email transcripts that really just like visually make it a striking text to engage with. So that would be my first recommendation for people who love Severance. And then my last recommendation is actually Also called Severance, but it's unrelated to the TV show. It's a novel by Ling Ma. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with it, but it's about a millennial woman who works in an office job, and she's basically watching the apocalypse unfold after a plague spreads in the city that she lives in, and presumably the rest of the world. It's a really interesting commentary on the meaning of work, which is central to my research in the modern context, and also how work can sometimes be like a really interesting diversion for some people to distract us from what's happening in the rest of the world. But it's a great satire. It has like great dark humor. It's funny. And then last thing I'll shout out is School for Good Mothers, which is a dystopian novel by Jessamine Chan, about a mother who is sent to some sort of like government sponsored program to rehabilitate, quote unquote, mothers after they make one parenting mistake, so she can regain custody of her daughter who's been separated from her. And the book really explores interesting ideas around motherhood, surveillance, and dystopian societal pressures that women experience in this world of her novel. So yeah, those are my recommendations.
I've not come across that one, but Ling Ma's Severance is a wonderful novel.
Yeah.
1,000% echo that recommendation. Thanks, Taylor. Lots of things there for listeners to get stuck into. Mark, what about you then to wrap this up?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things. So I'm going to briefly mention the novel that I've used in teaching called Company by Max Barry, and that it's kind of on the borders of, I would say, a dystopian fiction. It certainly feels dystopian, and it has a sort of airs of being a bit like Severance as well. And it's kind of about really exploitative managerial practices, treating, like, dehumanizing people. It's very funny as well. And there's a scene early on with a stolen donut that kind of runs all the way through the novel. But it has really kind of dark tone to it about like managerialism and how workers are just treated like numbers on a spreadsheet, and we'll just practice management on these unsuspecting people, and learn from it for a management textbook almost. So there's a really strong connection with the business world. But the one that kind of connects as well with a lot of what Taylor's mentioned earlier is a novel called Red Clocks by Lenny Zumas. It's not so much a business related one, but it really connects with the themes. And one of the things I really liked about that, and Lenny Zumas has spoken about it as a paratopia, with it kind of the near future. And I think when she was writing it, she was drawing on some of the legislation going through the US sort of courts, not before the Supreme Court ruling on Roe versus Wade. And she was anticipating what was coming. And she takes it further than it's gone now, but already she anticipated the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And that had a really nice narrative of resistance in it, which I thought was really powerful on these themes of parenthood and fertility and who has the right to have children, who does not. And it talks about sexual orientation as well. So it really had a lovely thread throughout it that I think is really warming because of the resistance that was present in there, even amongst quite an oppressive system. And it feels all the more pertinent with what we're seeing at the moment, certainly in the United States, but elsewhere as well. So it's a novel that I will probably go back to it again and read again because I enjoyed it so much. But yeah, those two I would say are nice ones to get your teeth into, and enjoyable reads as well.
Brilliant. You can tell that you are listeners to the show because you had no qualms in giving lots of recommendations rather than the one I asked for. So you know that I'm really very generous with it. But I've had sort of guests before say, "Oh, can I have two or can I have three?" You guys have just given us two or three, no problem at all. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much, guys. It's been really great having you on the podcast, and I hope to speak to you again soon. And yeah, a safe journey. Well, I say safe journey home. Taylor, you seem to be at home. I can see Mark is somewhere in outer space. He's got this sort of cosmic background. Safe journey home, Mark, back to Earth. But thanks so much for coming on the show, and yeah, I hope to speak to you guys soon.
Yes, thank you for having us. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Taylor and Mark for joining us on the podcast. We really enjoyed thinking about the dystopian elements of both fictional and real work practices, the business of gender, and how work policies may in fact drive us towards something better something a little more utopian. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by rating and following the podcast, leaving a comment, or sending us an email on utopiananddystopianfictions@gmail.com. And, as ever, please do join us next time, where we will be exploring some more utopian and dystopian fictions.